On this ride from Charlotte to Washington, I want to line up Amtrak's Carolinian with the rails that once tried and failed to keep a collapsing Confederacy alive. We'll follow this modern train from Charlotte to Raleigh along the old North Carolina Railroad, then on toward Richmond. And alongside it, one Confederate rail officer from Raleigh whose job was to cannibalize his own state's tracks to feed that dying lifeline. The Carolinian slides out of Charlotte like it has all the time in the world. Glass towers fall away behind us, the yard fans out under the windows, and in a couple of minutes the city is already shrinking into billboards, warehouses, and the backs of neighborhoods most passengers never really see. Today, Charlotte sells itself as a banking hub and sports town. But its whole rise started with the rails under this train. Long before Amtrak, this was the western anchor of the North Carolina Railroad. A place where cotton, tobacco, and Piedmont textiles climbed aboard for the wider South and, eventually, the wider world. By the Civil War, that made Charlotte more than just another dot on the map. It was an inland rail junction with depots, shops, and connections reaching down toward South Carolina and up toward Raleigh and Greensboro. Exactly the kind of place a desperate government couldn't afford to lose. For Captain Edward T. Mallory, that mattered long before the war. As a boy from Raleigh, Charlotte was the distant, exciting end of the line, a place his father talked about in terms of shipment dates and rail connections, not skyline views. On his first visit here, he didn't see a banking capital. He saw smoke from roundhouse stacks, men in overalls walking the tracks with hammers over their shoulders, and locomotives that seemed big enough to pull the whole state behind them. Somewhere out in this same yard, his father pointed at a string of freight cars and said, "That's what ties Raleigh to the world, son. As long as the trains move, we're not alone out here." Under our wheels is that same Piedmont corridor the North Carolina Railroad opened in the 1850s. One steel spine from Goldsboro through Raleigh and Greensboro and Salisbury, all the way here to Charlotte. In peacetime it stitched together Piedmont economy. In the last year of the war, that same spine was folded into the only half-reliable route left to push men and supplies from the lower South. Through towns like Greensboro, toward the Richmond and Danville, and on into Lee's starving army at Petersburg. Somewhere in that last year, I imagine another train pulling out of this same Charlotte yard in the opposite direction of my own. The cars are jammed, uniforms crammed into doorways, men riding on steps and hanging off platforms, freight wedged into corners that were meant for people. The engine is tired, the couplers clank like bad teeth, and the conductor isn't worrying about Wi-Fi. He's worrying about whether the boiler will hold and whether there's still soundtrack all the way to Raleigh. On the manifest for that train is a name that hardly anyone remembers, Captain Edward T. Mallory of Raleigh. To the men pressed into the cars around him, he's just another officer in butternut, but his war looks very different from theirs. Edward isn't riding north to fire a musket. He's riding north with a satchel full of orders that will decide which trains move, which towns get cut off, and which rails. Maybe even the ones he grew up beside are about to be torn up and sent somewhere else. As my Carolinian gathers speed across the same red clay country, his world and mine start to overlap. My timetable from Charlotte to Raleigh is printed in clean, blue ink. His is scrawled and smudged, crammed with extra sections and emergency freights. I have an open seat next to me. Edward has men standing in the aisle, leaning over his shoulder, dozing against his arm. All of them counting on rails he already knows won't last the year. From here to Raleigh, I get a smooth ride through the Piedmont. For Captain Edward T. Mallory, the same stretch is a test. How many more trains can he push over a line that was built for peace before the war finally wears the iron down to nothing? Outside my window, Charlotte's sprawl gives way to long ranks of pines, brick mills, and little creeks cutting through red soil. Towns start to flick past with their water towers and grade crossings, and you can feel how this has always been one long corridor rather than a string of isolated dots. We're running the old North Carolina Railroad spine now. Charlotte up through Salisbury and Greensboro to Raleigh. The same line that once turned the Piedmont into a single market instead of scattered counties. In Edward's world, one of those towns, Greensboro, isn't just another stop. It's a Confederate storehouse and rail center, jammed with wounded soldiers, warehouses, and refugee traffic as the government tries to shove men and supplies north toward Virginia. In the last weeks of the war, Even Jefferson Davis's fleeing government will pass through Greensboro by rail, trying to outrun a collapse this very corridor can no longer prevent. On my Carolinian, it's a quiet blur outside the glass. On Edward's timetable, places like Greensboro are pressure points. Yards and depots that have to keep working if the last trains to Richmond and Lee's army are going to move at all. Somewhere between Charlotte's glass and Raleigh's government buildings, the railroad passes quieter places that had loud moments. Salisbury for us is just another name on the timetable. But in April 1865, Union cavalry under Stoneman rode hard for the depots and the Yadkin River bridge here. Smashing Confederate supplies and tearing up the very North Carolina Railroad we're gliding over now. A little farther east, near Durham Station, the corridor brushes past the fields around Bennett Place, where General Joseph Johnston surrendered his army to Sherman. The largest Confederate surrender of the war. And with it, any real hope that these rails could keep the Confederacy alive. For most of us on the Carolinian, Salisbury barely exists. You see a station sign, a brick platform, a few streets reaching toward the tracks, and then the train leans into the next curve and the town is gone. On my timetable, it's just another intermediate stop between Charlotte and Greensboro. In Edward's War, Salisbury is a different kind of stop entirely. By the middle of the conflict, this little rail town holds something enormous and terrible. The only major Confederate military prison in North Carolina, crammed into an old cotton mill by the tracks. On paper, it's meant for a couple of thousand Union prisoners. In practice, waves of transfers turn it into a human stockyard. Thousands upon thousands of men behind a fence, fed and housed according to whatever the railroad can bring in that week. I imagine Edward seeing Salisbury's name in his orders long before he sees the place. To him, it's a destination code and a set of numbers. So many cars loaded with prisoners from Virginia, so many cars of cornmeal and salt pork sent the other way to keep them barely alive. He doesn't have to walk past the prison stockade to feel its weight. He just has to watch the columns of rations and coal and firewood grow longer, even as the rest of the system is starving. By 1864, the prison is bursting. The Confederacy is running out of everything at once. Food, medicine, clothing, decent track, and Salisbury becomes a kind of cruel equation. Every train Edward manages to push through with supplies for the prison is a train that doesn't go to a field army. Every delay or missed shipment means the men behind that fence will crowd closer to the edge of survival. Then, in April 1865, the war crashes into Salisbury from the other direction. Union cavalry under George Stoneman comes slicing out of the mountains toward the railroad, aiming not just to free prisoners but to tear up the rails and bridges that tie western North Carolina into Edward's line. His orders are brutally specific. Wreck the North Carolina Railroad and the connecting Piedmont Railroad so they can't feed men or materiel toward Virginia again. Locals wake up to artillery and hoofbeats and smoke. By the end of the day, Confederate defenders have been swept aside. The prison compound is abandoned and burning, and government storehouses and workshops near the tracks are going up in flames. Edward doesn't hear the shouting or smell the smoke. He gets Salisbury's disaster as a series of short, brutal messages. One flimsy tells him the prison has been overrun and emptied. Another reports depots burned, supplies gone, cars destroyed. To a rail officer, those losses are measured not just in crates and barrels, but in future trains that now will never run. But for men like him, the real nightmare lies a few miles east of town at the Yadkin River. Out here, the North Carolina Railroad crosses the river on a high, spindly Yadkin River Railroad bridge. The longest span on the line, and the one structure Stoneman's orders might as well have circled in red. If his troopers can knock that bridge down, the chain from Charlotte through Salisbury toward Greensboro doesn't just bend. It snaps in two. So, while one part of the raiding column is hitting the town and its prison, another rides hard for the bridge. On the far side, Confederate guns and hurried earthworks claw back. They know as clearly as Edward does that if this span falls, the trains behind it don't just slow, they stop. In the end, the bridge survives that day, but the victory is thin. Track is torn up on the approaches, rails are bent and twisted, telegraph lines are cut, and cars that once rolled west out of Salisbury toward Charlotte sit as blackened hulks. On his map, Edward still has a line across the Yadkin. In reality, it's a scar, a route held together by emergency repairs and wishful thinking. My Carolinian doesn't show us any of that. We ease into Salisbury on smooth rail, stop for a handful of passengers, and then hum out over a solid, modern bridge that feels permanent in a way Edward's infrastructure never did. For the people in my car, the Yadkin River is just a flash of water through the trees, a momentary break in the pines before the next town. For Edward, this stretch was never background. It was a cluster of problems with names. A prison that ate resources faster than he could move them. A town whose depots and yards could vanish in one day of fire. A river crossing that carried the whole weight of the western Piedmont on a few vulnerable spans. And it wasn't just this Piedmont line under pressure. East of us, Union raids out of places like New Bern and Goldsboro were clawing at coastal railroads, smashing bridges and depots there too. Until the whole map of North Carolina rails looked less like a network and more like a collection of open wounds. The Carolinian doesn't slow much for Durham. From my window it's a quick montage. Old brick mills turned into lofts and breweries. A ballpark, university buildings peeking over the trees. Most people on this train know it for basketball, tobacco, or tech, not for the moment when the war along this line finally ran out of track. In Edward's world, Durham Station is just another small stop between Greensboro and Raleigh. Some sidings, a platform, a few warehouses hugging the North Carolina Railroad. On his maps, the real focus is always somewhere else. The big depots at Greensboro, the junctions that feed toward Virginia, the yards where trains to Richmond are made up out of whatever locomotives still run. The countryside between those dots is what he moves through, not what he thinks about. Just off that same stretch of track, in 1865, sits a modest homestead called Bennett Place. It's a farmhouse tucked back from the line in a patch of rolling North Carolina countryside. Fields, woods, a wagon road that crosses the rails and wanders off toward Raleigh. If Edward rode past here earlier in the war, he might have glanced out at the passing trees, maybe noticed a whiff of wood smoke, and gone back to tracing schedules in his head. By April 1865, everything around this corridor is coming apart. To the east, Sherman has marched through Georgia and South Carolina, and is now driving into North Carolina, using and wrecking rail lines as he goes. To the north, the Richmond and Danville is straining to feed Lee's army while Union forces cut the last approaches into Petersburg and Richmond. The map in Edward's office looks less like a network and more like a collection of disconnected scars. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, the commanders on both sides realize what the timetable has already told men like Edward. There's nothing left to be gained by pushing more trains into this corridor. Sherman is advancing from the south and west. Johnston's Confederate army in the Carolinas is bleeding out in front of him. Richmond has fallen. The government that Edward has been nudging trains toward is on the run. So instead of ordering more cars and locomotives onto these tracks, the generals do something that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier. They ride out and meet in person at the little farmhouse by the line. William Tecumseh Sherman comes up from his army's camps. Joseph E. Johnston rides in from his own scattered forces. They sit down at Bennett Place and try to write a timetable not for trains, but for surrender. On paper, the agreement they reach covers far more than the few miles of rail outside. It brings in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. The bulk of the Confederate forces still operating in the Carolinas campaign. It is, in terms of men and territory, the largest Confederate surrender of the war. On the ground, it has a blunt, simple meaning for the corridor we're riding. The troops who have been moving along this line in gray, many of them over the same North Carolina Railroad Edward has been trying to hold together from Charlotte through Salisbury and Greensboro to Raleigh. They're told to stack their rifles, sign paroles, and go home. Whatever else the rails are after that day, they are no longer the veins of a country at war. My Carolinian slips past the Bennett Place turnoff in a couple of easy minutes. The tracks here feel anonymous. Ballast, ditches, trees, the same view you get anywhere in the Piedmont. Somewhere beyond the glass, a small sign marks the driveway to the site. Most riders never see it. If you know what you're looking at though, this is the spot where the war that gave Edward his job quietly rode him out of it. Every order he's signed to pull up rails from branch lines, every sleepless night spent trying to keep the North Carolina Railroad fed and flowing toward Richmond. Every compromise that cut his own state off so the capital could have one more train. All of that evaporates in a handshake at a farmhouse by the line. By the time the Carolinian starts slowing for Raleigh, the ride has settled into that familiar Piedmont rhythm. Pines, ponds, subdivisions, a few old brick factories holding on along the line. People around me start to gather their stuff the way they always do before a big stop. Laptops closing, headphones coming off, bags dragged out from under seats for the short shuffle to the doors. On the timetable, Raleigh is just another city code, another promised arrival time. In Edward's life, it's the center of gravity. This isn't just the state capital. It's the town where he learned to tell time by whistles, where his father's business rose and fell on the reliability of the North Carolina Railroad that runs right under our wheels. As a boy, he watched the first NCRR trains roll into Raleigh. A marvel of iron and steam turning what had been days of wagon travel into a single day's ride. His father's shop shelves filled and emptied on the railroad's schedule. Flour and salt coming in, tobacco and cotton going out, crates labeled with place names that, for Edward, existed first as destinations on the line before he ever saw them on a map. When the whistle blew and the cars rolled in, Raleigh felt less isolated, more like the middle of something instead of the edge. In those years, the line from Goldsboro through Raleigh up to Greensboro and Charlotte was a promise. It said that North Carolina wouldn't be a coastal strip with a scattered interior anymore. It would be one state tied together by steel. North Carolina sent more men into Confederate service than any other state, and a huge share of them rode to war on this very spine. Charlotte to Salisbury to Greensboro to Raleigh, long before Edward ever saw what the war would do to the rails under them. Towns along the tracks started calling themselves railroad towns, and Raleigh's depot became more than just a platform, it was a pulse. Then the war comes, and the promise changes. Raleigh is still the capital, but the trains that pull in now carry troops, wounded men, government clerks, refugees crowding into town as the front lurches closer. The North Carolina Railroad that once made his father's ledgers grow now makes the streets feel crowded and brittle. Too many uniforms. Too many rumors riding the rails in and out of the city. Edward, now in Confederate gray with a quartermaster's commission, sees his hometown from a different angle. His days are spent in offices near the tracks, reading reports from places you and I have just ridden through. Car shortages in Charlotte, destroyed depots in Salisbury, overloaded storehouses in Greensboro. Raleigh is no longer just home. It's a node in a system that's coming apart, a point where he's supposed to make bad numbers add up. As the war grinds into its last year, the line east of here becomes just as important as the line west. Sherman is moving up from the south, smashing railroads in Georgia and South Carolina, then turning into North Carolina itself. He drives on Goldsboro and then toward Raleigh, using and wrecking rail lines as he goes. Every time Edward finds a way to keep trains moving on the western half of his North Carolina railroad spine, another flimsy reminds him that the eastern half is being hammered into scrap. The day Sherman's blue uniforms appear on the outskirts of Raleigh, the meaning of this station changes again. Confederate authorities scramble. Some records and supplies are hustled westward by rail, some are simply left behind, and some never make it onto cars at all. The government that Edward has been quietly feeding with trains from his own state is already collapsing into flight, hugging the same corridor through Greensboro that we traced earlier. My train rolls into a very different city. The modern Raleigh station is cleaner, quieter, a kind of glass and brick handshake between the railroad and a 21st century skyline. College kids haul duffels, state employees and lanyards step off with coffee cups in hand. The loudest argument is over rideshares and parking, not invading armies. But the tracks that slide under us as we pull out again are descendants of the same Goldsboro-Raleigh-Greensboro line Edward spent his war trying to keep alive. The railroad through Raleigh stopped being one side's lifeline and became everybody's tool. The North Carolina Railroad keeps running. But instead of feeding Richmond, it's stitching together a reunited state in a reunited country. Leaving Raleigh, the Carolinian settles back into its long stride north. On my schedule, it's just another block of running time. On Edward's desk, this is where his world stops being just North Carolina and plugs into something larger and more desperate. The Richmond and Danville Railroad, last real artery into a starving army. From the beginning of the war, rail lines radiated into Richmond and Petersburg from every direction. For a long time the Confederacy survived by juggling them, robbing one to feed another. By 1864, after years of campaigning and raids, the options have narrowed. Lines from the coast are cut or threatened. The routes into Petersburg are under Union attack. And what's left, more and more, is a chain of rails that runs up through his own state and into the Richmond and Danville. That's the destination hiding under every waybill he signs in Raleigh. He might ink Greensboro or Danville as the last stop, but he knows the real journey doesn't end there. Cars of cornmeal, cartridges, boots, and bacon roll north into Virginia, are switched and sorted, and then are pushed on again toward the trenches around Petersburg, where Robert E. Lee is trying to hold a line that's slowly strangling his country. The Richmond and Danville was never meant to be the sole lifeline for a capital and its army. It was built as a commercial route, connecting inland markets to a city on the James. Now it's jammed with everything the Confederacy has left. Refugee trains fleeing Sherman's path, hospital trains carrying the wreckage of battles, freight trains loaded with rations that were already late when they left North Carolina. In Richmond, the strain is visible before you even reach the depots. Coal smoke hangs over the city. Lines of wagons and soldiers snake through the streets toward the yards. Locomotives wheeze and clank in and out like overworked animals. Inside the quartermaster offices, officers who look a lot like Edward argue over priorities with maps and ledgers and lists of shortages. Somewhere up the line, outside the city itself, Lee's army at Petersburg is living at the far end of that arithmetic. Rations shrink, supply dumps thin out, and the trains they're counting on arrive late or not at all. One of the cruelest measures of how thin that lifeline has become comes near the end. When Lee was dug in around Petersburg, his lifeline wasn't just the trenches. It was the rails running south and west out of the city. Union troops hammered those lines, seizing and tearing up the Weldon Railroad near Globe Tavern, then later cutting the South Side Railroad near places like Sutherland Station, until Lee's last supply route into Petersburg was gone. When Lee tries to pull his army out of Petersburg and head west, expecting trains sent down this very chain to meet him with food at places like Amelia Courthouse, instead, thanks to miscommunication, delay, and the simple exhaustion of the system, the rations never appear. Union troops have already cut the Richmond and Danville at Petersville, forcing Lee off his last working railroad and onto muddy country roads. The army that has been bled for years is forced to waste precious time foraging. Its final march crippled not by a single dramatic battlefield defeat, but by the failure of the rails that were supposed to save it. For Edward, those failures are a kind of choking at the far end of his work. He spent years pulling up track from branch lines in his own state, cannibalizing small towns and secondary routes so that this main artery can be kept alive. He signed the orders that turned places like Salisbury into scars, accepted that his own hometown's comfort would be sacrificed so trains to Richmond could still move. And now, even here in the capital's shadow, he can see that the system he's been feeding is too damaged to do what's being asked of it. When my Carolinian curves toward modern Richmond, we're gliding over infrastructure that's been rebuilt and relaid so many times the wartime version is almost a ghost. There are still yards and bridges, still industrial buildings squatting near the tracks. But the crisis that once defined every siding here is gone. Passenger announcements talk about connections and ride shares and the cafe menu, not emergency movements and ration shortages. From this point on, north of Richmond, my train runs onto rails Edward never controls. Lines built and maintained by the side that won the logistics war he lost. For him, this city and the battered Richmond and Danville that feeds it are the farthest edge of his world. The point where all the sacrifices along the North Carolina Railroad either pay off or vanish into delay and disappointment. For me, Richmond is just one more stop on the way to Washington. North of Richmond, the scenery doesn't announce the change. You don't get a line of blue uniforms at the state border. But for a Confederate rail officer, this whole stretch exists only as rumor and threat. The web of tracks feeding the armies that are trying to kill his lifeline from the south. In my car, the rhythm is pure corridor. The Carolinian leans into curves, crosses rivers on heavy steel, threads past suburban stations where commuters wait with briefcases and backpacks. You can feel us being pulled toward Washington the way freight once was pulled toward the war. Steadily, almost casually. As if there were never any question the train would make it. By the time my train is skirting the last bends of the Potomac, Edward's war is over. The North Carolina Railroad he spent years cannibalizing and defending is on its way to becoming part of a very different network. One national system instead of two competing ones. The Richmond and Danville corridor he tried to feed into Richmond will eventually be folded into new corporate names and timetables. Its wartime desperation paved over by decades of ordinary freight and passenger runs. Washington itself is the clearest contrast of all. Today it's a terminal with multiple platforms and departure boards. A cella, regional trains, long-distance sleepers, all of them lined up under the same flag. People step off my Carolinian and melt into a crowd that never thinks about which lines used to be Union or Confederate. They're just trying to find the right escalator, the right metro, the right exit. Standing on the platform in Washington, with my journey from Charlotte technically complete, it's hard not to think about the two completely different stories that rode this same geometry of rail. The one I'm living is simple. A state-sponsored day train tying the Carolinas into the Northeast Corridor. A clean schedule line on a website. The one Edward lived was anything but simple. A boy from Raleigh falling in love with the first trains into his hometown. A wartime rail officer stripping his own state's rails to keep a collapsing country alive. And a man who has to watch the trains keep running after the cause they served is gone. Most of the people stepping off around me will never hear his name, and they don't need to. The point of telling his story isn't to rescue him from obscurity. It's to remember that this comfortable corridor was built on top of a much harsher experiment. Somewhere under the concrete and ballast and welded rail, there's still the outline of a system that once tried to hold together a country that couldn't hold itself together. The Carolinian will turn around and head south again tonight, tracing the same path back through Richmond, Raleigh, Greensboro, Salisbury, and Charlotte. The rails will hum, the signals will flicker from red to green, and the timetable will, more or less, hold. If you listen closely out the window though, especially in the quiet stretches between the big stations, you can still hear the echo of another timetable entirely. The one Captain Edward T. Mallory held in his hands, counting trains not in minutes later on time, but in how long they could keep a collapsing world from finally coming off the rails. Down here, the story ends with Edward's trains running out of cause. But the rails themselves keep going. South into the Carolinas, deeper into the old Confederacy, and farther into the places where this war burned hottest. Next time, we're going to follow one of those lines out of North Carolina and into South Carolina. Riding the Meteor or the Silver Star through the swamps and sandhills where Sherman's men tore up iron by the mile. And whole towns woke up to find their future bent into Sherman's neckties. We'll trade the Piedmont pines for pine barrens and river crossings. And see what happens when a modern Florida-bound train glides over ground that once watched an army slice, straight through the heart of a seceded state. For now, I'm keen on the rails. And I'll see you on the next train out of history.